Annie sat outside the interview room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for her name to be called. The position was for a sales representative. It wasn't the kind of product she had once loved selling, but that didn't matter anymore. After the end of her 18-year marriage, all she wanted was the chance to work again. 18 years earlier, Annie had walked away from the career she loved to stay home and raise her children while taking care of the family. She had never regretted that decision. But now, at 42, she wanted to find herself again. Reality, however, had been far crueler than she expected. 19 companies had already turned her away. The reason was always the same. She was too old. At 42, employers wanted younger candidates, not someone trying to restart a career after nearly 2 decades away from the workforce. Still, Annie refused to give up. This was the 20th company. She felt more hopeful than before. It was only a small business with a few dozen employees, and she knew she still had something valuable to offer. Experience, responsibility, and years of working with customers weren't things that disappeared with age. Even so, the waiting area made her confidence waver. Around her sat young men and women no older than 24 or 25. For a brief moment, it felt like looking at the person she had been 18 years ago. When her name was finally called, Annie took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked into the interview room. 10 minutes later, she walked back out. The disappointment on her face said everything before a single word was spoken. Was there really no place left for middle-aged people who simply wanted another chance? Annie stepped outside with a quiet sigh. Across the street, Maya, her oldest daughter, spotted her immediately. "I figured this might happen," Maya said with a playful smile as she walked over. "So don't be too upset. Since you failed today, lunch is on me." Annie couldn't help but laugh. "Fine," she replied. "Then I'm ordering the most expensive thing on the menu and spending all your money." "Go ahead," Maya teased. "I only invited you because I knew you'd say that." Mother and daughter laughed together before walking hand in hand down the busy sidewalk, trying to leave behind another rejection and the painful reality that after 18 years as a housewife, even the simple dream of working again had become far harder than Annie had ever imagined. Annie and Maya pushed open the door of Sweet Memory, the little ice cream shop that had become their favorite family place. They settled into their usual table by the window after Annie's 20th job interview. "So, what did they say this time?" Maya asked. Annie let out a quiet sigh. "They said my experience and skills were exactly what they needed." She forced a smile. "But they also said I was too old for the position." Maya rolled her eyes. "Their loss." Annie shrugged. "I guess 42 isn't the age companies are looking for when they're hiring salespeople." Maya suddenly grinned. "By the way, aren't you afraid Dad might walk in here?" Annie laughed. "So what if he does? What if he sits right next to us? Then he can sit at another table. And if he wants to eat here? That's his business. This place doesn't belong to him." Maya burst into laughter. "There she is. That's the mom I know." A waitress walked over with a smile. "What can I get for you?" "Strawberry, please," Annie replied without looking at the menu. "Vanilla for me," Maya said. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with 2 cups of ice cream. Annie reached for her strawberry ice cream before glancing at Maya's cup. She frowned. "You ordered vanilla on purpose, didn't you?" Maya blinked innocently. "Mom, I can eat whatever flavor I want." Annie narrowed her eyes. "Out of every flavor in this shop, you had to pick vanilla?" Maya burst into laughter. "See? I knew you'd react like this." Annie shook her head, pretending to be annoyed. Then her eyes settled on the 2 cups resting side by side on the table. Strawberry. Vanilla. Her smile slowly disappeared. 18 years earlier, those had been the exact same 2 flavors sitting between her and Thomas on their very first date. 18 years earlier, Sweet Memory was just as warm as it was today. The afternoon sun poured through the windows, painting soft golden patches across the wooden floor. Annie pushed open the door with both hands, nervously smoothing the wrinkles on her dress before looking around. Thomas was already waiting by the window. The moment he saw her, he stood up so quickly that he nearly knocked over his chair. "Hi," Annie smiled shyly. "Sorry I'm late." Thomas shook his head. "I've only been here a few minutes." He pulled out the chair across from him. "Please." Annie sat down, trying to hide how nervous she was. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds before they both laughed at the awkward silence. So, Thomas scratched the back of his neck. I guess first dates are always a little weird. Annie nodded, laughing softly. I was just thinking the same thing. The tension melted away almost instantly. They spent the next half hour talking about work, family, and everything in between. Annie told him she worked in phone accessories sales and dreamed of one day opening a small shop of her own. Thomas listened without interrupting, genuinely interested in every word she said. When the waitress came over, Annie didn't even need the menu. Strawberry, please. Thomas smiled. Vanilla for me. The waitress walked away, leaving the two of them smiling at each other again. Can I ask you something? Thomas said. Go ahead. Why strawberry? Annie looked at him and laughed. Because it's sweet without trying too hard. That's a surprisingly serious answer for ice cream. Well, you asked. Thomas chuckled. Fair enough. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with their ice cream. As Annie reached for her spoon, Thomas pulled a tiny gift box from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. Annie blinked in surprise. What's this? Just open it. Inside was a small silver charm shaped like a bear. Annie looked up at him with a puzzled smile. A bear? Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly embarrassed. I don't know. Bears look strong on the outside, but they're actually gentle. It reminded me of the kind of man I hope to become. Annie held the tiny charm in her palm before smiling warmly. Then I guess you're bear now. Thomas laughed. Bear? It suits you. Annie glanced toward the small display shelf near the register, stood up for a moment, and returned carrying another tiny box. Then this is for you. Thomas opened it and found a silver lion charm inside. A lion? Annie smiled, because every bear needs a lion beside him. Thomas looked at the little charm, then back at Annie. A slow smile spread across his face. Bear and lion. Annie nodded. Bear and lion. Neither of them knew it then, but those two little charms would stay with them for the next 18 years. Over the next several months, Thomas slowly became the most important person in Annie's life. He wasn't the kind of man who tried to impress her with expensive gifts or fancy restaurants. Instead, he paid attention to the little things. He remembered she always took the pickles out of her burgers. He knew she preferred coffee without sugar. Whenever Annie had to work late, Thomas would wait outside her store without a single complaint. On weekends, they wandered through bookstores, shared street food, or simply sat together at Sweet Memory talking for hours. The more time Annie spent with him, the more she realized she no longer had to carry every burden alone. One evening, the two of them sat beside the river watching the city lights shimmer across the water. Thomas broke the comfortable silence. Lion, Annie smiled. Thomas took a slow breath before speaking. I'm not where I want to be yet. I'm still trying to build my career. I can't promise I'll make you rich overnight. Annie quietly listened. Thomas gently held her hand. But I can promise that no matter what happens, I'll never let you face life by yourself. Annie looked into his eyes. There wasn't a trace of hesitation in his voice. She believed every word. A few months later, Thomas received his first promotion at the electronics company where he worked. It wasn't a huge achievement, but he couldn't wait to tell Annie. Instead of celebrating somewhere expensive, they returned to Sweet Memory. The waitress brought over the familiar strawberry and vanilla ice cream without even asking. Thomas laughed as he raised his spoon. Looks like Bear is finally moving up in the world. Annie laughed with him. I told you you'd make it. Thomas shook his head. No, we made it. Annie felt warmth spread through her chest as she looked at the man sitting across from her. For the first time in her life, the future didn't seem uncertain anymore. She truly believed they would build every tomorrow together. She had no idea that one day, to protect that future, she would willingly give up the career she had worked so hard to build. Life moved faster than either of them expected. A year after Thomas's promotion, he got another opportunity. This time, the position came with a much bigger salary, longer hours, and far greater responsibilities. The company wanted him to relocate to Atlanta to help lead a new division. Annie didn't hesitate for a second. She packed their apartment into a handful of boxes and moved with him. The first few months were exciting. They rented a small apartment, bought secondhand furniture, and celebrated every little milestone together. Not long after settling into their new life, Annie found out she was pregnant. Thomas couldn't stop smiling the day he saw the ultrasound for the first time. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, holding Annie's hand so tightly that she laughed. As Annie's pregnancy progressed, the morning sickness became worse. She often felt exhausted before noon, yet she still insisted on going to work. One evening, Thomas found her asleep on the couch, still wearing her work clothes. He gently covered her with a blanket before sitting beside her. "Lion." Annie slowly opened her eyes. "Hmm?" Thomas hesitated for a moment. "Annie, maybe it's time for you to quit your job." Annie immediately shook her head. "No, I like working." "I know." Thomas squeezed her hand. "But you don't have to carry everything anymore. Let me take care of us for a while." Annie looked down at her growing belly. She had spent years building her career in phone accessories sales. She loved meeting customers, learning about new products, and dreaming that one day she might open a small shop of her own. Walking away from that dream wasn't easy. Thomas gently rested his hand on her stomach. "Our baby needs you more than any company does." Annie remained silent for a long time. Finally, she smiled through watery eyes. "Just until the baby grows up," she said softly. "Then I'll go back to work." Thomas kissed her forehead without realizing that promise would take far longer than either of them imagined. The next morning, Annie handed in her resignation. She walked out of the store, carrying a small cardboard box filled with the belongings she had collected over the years. Before getting into Thomas's car, she turned around for one last look, and she smiled, believing she would return in just a few years. She didn't know that the goodbye she had whispered to her career would last for the next 18 years. The years passed more quickly than Annie ever imagined. Maya became a big sister when Rich was born, and a few years later, Bella completed their family. Their small apartment gradually became a comfortable home. Thomas kept climbing the corporate ladder, leaving earlier each morning and coming home later each night. Annie stayed behind, making sure everything else never fell apart. Every morning began before sunrise. She packed lunches for Maya, Rich, and Bella, woke them for school, folded laundry, cleaned the house, paid bills, scheduled doctor's appointments, helped with homework, and somehow still had dinner waiting on the table before Thomas walked through the front door. No one ever asked how many hours she worked. Because she wasn't earning a paycheck anymore, it slowly became invisible. Whenever friends asked what she did, Annie would simply smile. "I'm a stay-at-home mom." It sounded simple. Living it never was. Once in a while, she would pass an electronics store and stop for a few seconds, looking at the newest phone accessories displayed in the window. She still knew what every product was. She still understood the market better than most people. Then she'd smile to herself and keep walking, reminding herself that there would be time later. Every birthday, Thomas gave her something thoughtful. Sometimes it was flowers. Sometimes it was jewelry. Every anniversary, they still visited sweet memory. Annie always ordered strawberry. Thomas always ordered vanilla. They still called each other Lion and Bear. From the outside, they looked like the perfect couple. Friends envied them. Their children admired them. Even Annie believed all the sacrifices had been worth it. She kept telling herself the same thing every year. When the kids are older, I'll go back to work. Then elementary school became middle school. Middle school became high school. Before she realized it, 18 years had slipped away. One morning, while cleaning a closet, Annie found the cardboard box she had carried home on the day she resigned. Inside were her old employee name tag, a few notebooks, several training certificates, and a faded business card with her name printed beneath the words, "Sales Consultant." Annie gently brushed the dust from the card and smiled. Maybe it's finally time. That afternoon, she opened her laptop and began updating her resume for the first time in 18 years. Updating her resume took Annie nearly an entire afternoon. She stared at the screen longer than she spent typing. 18 years of experience had been replaced by a single sentence: full-time homemaker. When she finally clicked save, she leaned back and let out a long breath. The next morning, she started applying for jobs. One application became 5. 5 became 12, then 20. Most companies never replied. A few sent polite rejection emails. One afternoon, Annie was invited to an interview for a sales position at a consumer electronics retailer. She spent almost an hour choosing what to wear before settling on a navy blazer she hadn't touched in years. Standing in front of the mirror, she smiled at herself. "You can do this." The interview lasted less than 20 minutes. The hiring manager thanked her for coming, complimented her previous experience, then glanced at the 18-year gap on her resume. "The industry has changed a lot," he said carefully. "We need someone who can adapt quickly." Annie nodded politely, even though she already knew what the answer would be. She thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out with the same smile she had practiced in front of the mirror that morning. It disappeared the moment the elevator doors closed. She sat alone inside her car for several minutes before starting the engine. When she arrived home, Thomas was already there. "How did it go?" he asked. Annie forced a smile as she slipped off her shoes. "Not this one." Thomas walked over and wrapped his arms around her. "You'll find the right place." Annie rested her head against his shoulder and nodded. "Yeah, I will." She wanted to believe him, so she applied again the next day, and the day after that. Then another week passed, another interview, another rejection, another polite smile. Little by little, Annie began realizing that the world she had left behind 18 years earlier had kept moving without her. After her 20th rejection, Annie realized something hurt even more than not finding a job. Somewhere along the way, she and Thomas had stopped living as husband and wife. They were simply sharing the same house. At first, she blamed his workload. As CEO of a growing electronics company, Thomas left home before sunrise and rarely returned before dinner. Annie kept telling herself it was only a busy season. Once things settled down, everything would go back to normal. Instead of complaining, she decided to do something about it. On Friday afternoon, Annie stopped by the grocery store and bought everything Thomas loved. She spent nearly 3 hours in the kitchen preparing dinner, carefully setting the table with candles and the nice plates they usually saved for anniversaries. Maya walked downstairs and smiled at the sight. Rich wandered into the kitchen a moment later, stealing a piece of bread before Annie gently shooed him away, while Bella happily helped arrange the napkins exactly the way her mother showed her. "What's the special occasion?" Maya asked. Annie adjusted the flowers in the middle of the table. "Nothing. I just thought your dad and I haven't had a proper dinner together in a long time." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Trying to win him over again?" Annie laughed softly. "Maybe." 7 o'clock passed. Then 8. The steak slowly turned cold. Rich eventually asked if they should start eating without Dad, while Bella quietly rested her head against Annie's shoulder. Annie forced a smile. "Let's wait a little longer." At 8:30, Thomas finally called. "I'm sorry, Lion. A client flew in unexpectedly. I can't leave the office." Annie looked at the untouched dinner. "It's okay. I'll make it up to you this weekend." "Okay." She smiled, even though he couldn't see it. Saturday came. Annie suggested going for a walk after dinner like they used to years ago. Thomas apologized. Another meeting. The following week, Annie bought 2 tickets to a jazz concert. Thomas promised he'd be there. 30 minutes before the show, her phone buzzed. "Emergency board meeting. I'm sorry." Annie quietly folded the tickets and slipped them into her purse. She never mentioned them again. She refused to give up. Some mornings she woke up early just to have breakfast with him before work. Other evenings she asked if they could watch a movie together. Sometimes she simply wanted 10 quiet minutes on the back porch to talk about their day. Every time, Thomas had another phone call, another business dinner, another deadline, or another promise that next week would be different. He never raised his voice. He never treated her badly. He was simply never there. One night, Annie carried 2 cups of coffee onto the back porch out of habit. She sat alone for nearly half an hour before the coffee turned cold. Looking at the empty chair across from her, she finally understood something she had refused to admit for months. A marriage couldn't be saved by one person alone. Time kept moving, but nothing changed. Annie stopped asking Thomas to go out. She stopped planning surprise dinners. She stopped waiting in the living room for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. Instead, she quietly convinced herself that this was simply what long marriages looked like. One evening, Thomas came home almost 2 hours later than usual. Annie was still awake, folding laundry in the family room. "Long day?" she asked with a tired smile. Thomas loosened his tie. "Yeah, we had to finish preparing for a new product launch." Annie nodded and didn't ask anything else. As Thomas walked past her, a faint perfume drifted through the air. Annie paused for a second before looking down at the towel in her hands. It wasn't her perfume. She almost asked about it. Instead, she told herself it probably came from someone at the office. The next few weeks became even busier for Thomas. More business dinners, more weekend meetings, more overnight trips. His phone was always face down whenever he came home. Sometimes it vibrated several times during dinner, but he never answered in front of the family. "Work," he would say before carrying the phone into another room. Annie wanted to believe him. She truly did. Then one afternoon, while dropping off some documents Thomas had forgotten at home, she arrived at his office without telling him. His assistant looked surprised to see her. "Mrs. Smith, Mr. Smith isn't here." Annie smiled. "That's okay. I'll just leave these on his desk." The assistant hesitated. "He's having lunch with a client." Annie nodded politely and handed over the folder before leaving. Through the lobby's glass windows, she happened to glance across the street. Thomas was sitting outside a small restaurant. Across from him sat a young woman Annie had never seen before. They weren't holding hands. They weren't kissing. They were simply talking. Then the woman laughed. Thomas smiled back in a way Annie hadn't seen in years. Annie stood there for several seconds before quietly turning away. She told herself it was probably business. She wanted that explanation to be true more than anything. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny crack had just become impossible to ignore. After that afternoon, Annie tried to convince herself she was imagining things. Thomas had spent years building his company. Of course he would meet clients. Of course he would work with younger employees. She refused to let one lunch destroy 18 years of trust. But once doubt entered her mind, she began noticing things she had overlooked before. Thomas smiled at his phone more often than he smiled at home. He carried it everywhere, even to the bathroom. Whenever it rang, he stepped outside to answer. If Annie walked into the room while he was texting, the screen would be locked before she reached him. None of those things proved anything. Yet together, they slowly chipped away at the marriage Annie had spent nearly 2 decades protecting. One Friday evening, Thomas kissed Annie on the forehead before grabbing his car keys. "Business dinner. Don't wait up." Annie smiled as she always did. "Drive safely." An hour later, Maya came downstairs holding her phone. "Mom, have you seen this?" Annie looked up from the laundry. Maya hesitated before turning the screen around. It was a photo someone had posted online from an upscale downtown restaurant. Several executives from Thomas's company were gathered around a long table celebrating a successful product launch. Annie recognized Thomas immediately. She also recognized the young woman from outside the restaurant a few weeks earlier. She wasn't sitting across from him this time. She was sitting beside him. They were leaning toward each other, laughing while everyone else looked toward the camera. Annie stared at the photo without saying a word. Maya frowned. "Isn't that the woman you told me about?" Annie forced herself to smile. "It's probably nothing." Maya looked unconvinced but didn't argue. After Maya went upstairs, Annie opened the photo again. Her fingers slowly zoomed in. Thomas's hand rested beneath the table. The woman's hand rested there too. Most of it was hidden by the tablecloth. Only their fingers were visible. They were intertwined. Annie felt the room spin around her. She looked at the front door, waiting for Thomas to come home and somehow explain what she had just seen. Deep down, however, she already knew there was no explanation that could put 18 years back together. Thomas came home just after 10 that night. As soon as he stepped inside, he sensed something was different. The house was quiet. The television was off. Annie was sitting alone at the dining table with her phone in front of her. "You're still awake?" he asked. Annie looked at him calmly. "How was your business dinner?" Thomas loosened his tie. "It went well." Annie nodded once. "Who was there?" "The management team. A few department heads." Annie picked up her phone and turned the screen toward him. The photo from the restaurant filled the display. Thomas's expression froze for the first time that evening. "I see your management team," Annie said quietly. "I also see her." Thomas remained silent. "Who is she?" After several long seconds, he answered. "Her name is Sophia. She joined the company a few months ago." Annie looked into his eyes. "Are you having an affair?" Thomas immediately shook his head. "No." Annie kept staring at him. "Then why are you holding her hand?" Thomas lowered his eyes. The silence between them lasted so long that it became its own answer. Annie felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "How long?" Thomas finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. A few months. Annie closed her eyes. 18 years of marriage suddenly felt impossibly fragile. Why? She asked. Thomas rubbed his forehead. I don't know when it happened. Annie laughed bitterly. People don't accidentally fall into someone else's arms, Thomas. He looked at her with guilt written across his face. I never meant to hurt you. Annie slowly stood up. But you did. Thomas took a step toward her. Annie, we can fix this. She shook her head. I spent months trying to fix this marriage by myself. Her voice finally trembled. I cooked your favorite meals. I waited for you every night. I asked you to spend time with me. I kept believing every promise you made. She looked directly into his eyes. While I was trying to save our marriage, you were building another relationship. Thomas had no words left. Annie wiped away a tear before it could fall. Tonight, I finally understand something. Thomas looked up hopefully. Annie's voice was calm, almost painfully calm. The marriage I was trying to save no longer exists. Thomas stood speechless as Annie quietly walked past him and closed the bedroom door behind her. Neither of them slept that night. The next morning, Annie woke before sunrise, just as she had for nearly 20 years. She made coffee. She packed lunches for Maya, Rich, and Bella. She prepared breakfast without saying a word. The house felt strangely normal, as if nothing had happened the night before. Thomas came downstairs looking exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. Can we talk? He asked quietly. Annie placed a plate on the table. Eat before it gets cold. Thomas didn't move. Please. Annie finally sat across from him. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Thomas broke the silence first. I ended it. Annie looked at him without emotion. Last night. She nodded once. Okay. Thomas frowned. That's all? Annie folded her hands together. What else should I say? I'm sorry. Annie gave a faint, tired smile. I know you are. Thomas leaned forward. I'll do anything to fix this. Annie looked at the man she had loved since she was 22. She remembered the ice cream shop, the bear and lion keychains, the promises by the river, the years they had spent building a family together. She also remembered every dinner he had missed, every broken promise, every lonely night, and the photo that had shattered everything she believed. Do you know what's strange? Annie asked softly. Thomas waited. If you had come home 6 months ago and asked me to fight for this marriage, I would have done anything. Tears filled her eyes. But I already fought. Thomas lowered his head. Annie continued, I fought alone. The room fell silent again. Upstairs, the quiet sound of the children getting ready for school drifted through the house, a reminder that every choice they made would affect more than just the two of them. Finally, Annie stood and walked upstairs. A few minutes later, she returned holding a folder. She placed it gently on the dining table. Thomas looked down. Divorce papers. His face turned pale. Annie, I met with a lawyer this morning. Thomas stared at her in disbelief. You're serious? Annie nodded. For the first time in a long time, Thomas's voice cracked. Please don't do this. Annie took a slow breath. I've spent almost 20 years putting this family before myself. She looked directly into his eyes. I'm not leaving because you loved someone else. Thomas frowned. Annie continued, I'm leaving because somewhere along the way, you stopped choosing us. Tears finally rolled down Thomas's face. Annie quietly removed the bear keychain from her purse and placed it beside the divorce papers. I think it's time you keep this, before walking toward the front door. She glanced once toward the staircase, where Maya, Rich, and Bella were getting ready to leave for school, silently promising herself that whatever happened next, she would keep moving forward for them as much as for herself. Without another word, she walked toward the front door. This time, Thomas didn't know how to stop her, and Annie no longer wanted him to. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. There were no dramatic courtroom arguments, no shouting, no last-minute change of heart. Just 2 signatures, 2 wedding rings placed into separate pockets, and 20 years of marriage reduced to a stack of legal documents. Thomas moved into a condominium near the company's headquarters, while Annie remained in the family home with Maya. The house suddenly felt much larger than before. Every room reminded Annie of the life she had spent 2 decades building. For the first few weeks, She still caught herself setting out 2 coffee mugs every morning before quietly putting one back into the cabinet. Some habits refused to disappear overnight. Maya divided her time between both parents, spending weekdays with Annie and occasional weekends with Thomas. Neither Annie nor Thomas ever spoke badly about the other in front of her. Their marriage had ended, but they refused to make Maya choose between them. Life settled into a new routine. Thomas buried himself even deeper in work. Annie continued searching for a job. Every morning, she opened her laptop, searched job listings, tailored her resume, and submitted more applications. Every afternoon, she waited for replies that rarely came. Most companies never responded. The few that did politely thanked her before choosing another candidate. Weeks passed, and the rejection emails kept arriving. One afternoon, Annie returned home after another unsuccessful interview. She dropped her folder onto the kitchen counter and sank into a chair. She had answered every question well. The interviewer had smiled throughout the meeting. Yet she already knew the answer before opening the email that arrived an hour later. "We appreciate your interest, but we have decided to move forward with another candidate." Annie quietly closed the laptop. She wasn't angry anymore. She was simply exhausted. Later that evening, she stood alone in the living room, looking around the house. The polished wooden floors, the family photographs lining the walls, the furniture she had chosen years ago. Every corner reflected the years she had devoted to supporting someone else's dream. She whispered to herself, "Who am I without this family?" It was the first time she had asked herself that question. For 20 years, she had been Thomas's wife. She had been Maya's mother. She had organized birthdays, packed lunches, cleaned the house, supported Thomas's career, and put everyone else's needs before her own. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped thinking about the woman she used to be. Annie slowly picked up her old resume from the table. She looked at her own name for a long moment before taking a deep breath. If no company believed in her anymore, then she would have to start believing in herself first. That quiet realization became the first real step toward rebuilding a life that belonged to Annie alone. A week after the divorce became official, Annie received another interview invitation. This time, it was for a sales associate position at a consumer electronics retailer. She spent the entire evening preparing, researching the company, and practicing answers in front of the mirror. The interview itself went well. The manager smiled often, complimented her communication skills, and even said her previous sales experience was impressive. For the first time in months, Annie drove home feeling hopeful. The next afternoon, an email arrived. "Thank you for your time. Unfortunately, we've decided to move forward with another candidate whose experience more closely matches our current needs." Annie stared at the screen for several minutes before quietly closing the laptop. She didn't cry. She simply leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. Maya walked into the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Another rejection?" Annie nodded. Maya placed a mug beside her mother. "I'm sorry." Annie forced a smile. "It's okay." Maya sat down across from her. "Do they ever tell you why?" Annie looked at the growing stack of rejection emails on her laptop. "Not directly." She paused before adding quietly, "But I think I already know." Maya remained silent. Annie continued, "Companies don't just see my experience. They also see an 18-year gap." She gave a tired laugh. "To them, I'm someone who disappeared from the workforce almost 2 decades ago." Maya reached across the table and gently held her mother's hand. "That doesn't mean you're not capable." Annie squeezed her daughter's hand and smiled. "I know." She looked back at the closed laptop. "But maybe I've been trying to walk through a door that no longer opens." The words hung in the air. Annie had spent months believing that if she kept trying hard enough, someone would eventually give her another chance. After 20 interviews and 20 rejections, she finally accepted a painful truth. Returning to life as an employee would be far more difficult than she had imagined. If she wanted to build a future, she might have to stop looking for her old life and start creating a new one instead. The next morning, Annie woke up before sunrise out of habit. She made coffee, packed Maya's lunch, and watched her leave for work. When the house became quiet again, Annie sat alone in the living room. For the first time in years, there was nothing she had to do. No husband coming home for dinner, no children to pick up from school, no appointments filling her calendar. She looked around the silent house and felt strangely out of place inside her own life. That afternoon, Thomas transferred the monthly support payment into her account, just as the divorce agreement required. Annie glanced at the notification before putting her phone aside. She never even checked the amount. When Maya came home that evening, she found her mother staring out the kitchen window. "Still thinking about the interview?" Annie nodded. Maya pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Mom, you don't have to rush." Annie looked at her. Maya continued, "Dad is still supporting us. We have enough savings, too. You don't need to force yourself to find a job immediately." Annie smiled appreciatively. "I know." Maya reached for her mother's hand. "Maybe you should take a break. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else." Annie stayed quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know why I've been trying so hard to find a job?" Maya shook her head. Annie looked around the empty house. "It was never about the money," she paused. "Your father is still fulfilling his responsibilities. Financially, we're okay." She took a slow breath. "I'm afraid that if I stay home much longer, I'll disappear." Maya frowned. Annie smiled sadly. "I don't want to spend another 20 years sitting in this house, waiting for life to happen." The words caught Maya by surprise. Annie continued quietly. "I need a reason to wake up every morning. I need to feel like I'm building something again. I need to know that I'm still capable of contributing to the world." Maya looked at her mother with new understanding. This wasn't a woman desperately searching for a paycheck. It was a woman searching for herself. Annie took another sip of coffee before saying softly, "If I can't go back to the life I had before, maybe it's time to build a different one." That was the first time she stopped asking, "Who will hire me?" and started asking, "What can I create?" The conversation stayed with Annie long after Maya went to bed. That night, she opened an old storage box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were photo albums, greeting cards, and a few folders from her previous career. Near the bottom, she found an old employee badge. She smiled as she brushed away the dust. The photo showed a much younger version of herself, full of confidence and ambition. The next afternoon, Maya noticed the badge lying on the dining table. "What's that?" Annie picked it up and laughed softly. "My first sales job." Maya turned it over in her hands. "You never told me much about it." Annie smiled. "That was a long time ago." Maya leaned forward with curiosity. "What exactly did you do?" Annie thought for a moment before answering. "I worked for a company that distributed mobile phone accessories. I visited retailers, introduced new products, negotiated prices, and built long-term relationships with store owners." Maya looked surprised. "So you already understand this industry?" Annie smiled faintly. "At least I used to. The products may have changed, but customers haven't. They still want something useful, reliable, and worth paying for." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "You understand customers. That doesn't disappear." Annie looked at her daughter for a moment. Maybe she was right. She might no longer know the newest products or the latest trends, but she still understood how to listen, how to sell, and how brands earned trust. Maya opened her laptop. "Then why don't we see what this industry looks like today?" Annie smiled. She looked at the old employee badge one more time before setting it gently on the table. That might not be a bad idea. Together, they pulled their chairs closer to the laptop, ready to discover how much the market had changed over the past 20 years. That evening, Maya opened her laptop while Annie brought 2 mugs of coffee to the dining table. They spent hours reading market reports, industry articles, and consumer trends. Every few minutes, Maya added another product category to a growing list in her notebook. Chargers, charging cables, wireless earbuds, power banks, phone cases, screen protectors. She looked at her mother. "Where do we even start?" Annie studied the list carefully. "Not every product is a good choice for a new business." Maya nodded. Annie pointed at the first few items on the list. Electronic accessories require certifications, strict quality control, and can become expensive warranty problems if anything goes wrong. We need something simpler. Maya crossed off chargers, cables, earbuds, and power banks before continuing her research. Nearly an hour later, she stopped scrolling. "Mom, look at this." Annie leaned closer. Several market reports showed that phone cases remained one of the best-selling mobile accessories worldwide. Every new phone release created fresh demand, and many customers owned multiple cases for the same device. Maya looked at Annie with excitement. "I think I found it." Annie continued reading the report before nodding slowly. "Tell me why." Maya smiled and counted on her fingers. "No complicated electronics. We can create our own designs instead of inventing new technology. The investment is much lower. And if we build a great brand, customers will choose us because they love the design and trust the brand." Annie remained quiet for several seconds. She remembered the years she spent selling phone accessories. Customers often searched for the cheapest charging cable. But phone cases were different. They weren't just protection. They were part of a person's style. People enjoyed collecting them, changing them, and matching them with their personalities. Annie smiled for the first time that evening. "You're right." She picked up a notebook and wrote across the top of a blank page, "Our first product." Beneath it, she carefully wrote two simple words, "Phone cases." The decision looked almost ordinary on paper. Neither Annie nor Maya realized that those two words would become the foundation of an entirely new chapter in their lives. After deciding on phone cases, Annie leaned back in her chair and frowned. "There's just one problem." Maya looked up from her laptop. "What's that?" Annie smiled nervously. "We don't know how to make phone cases." Maya laughed. "Neither do most brands." Annie blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Maya turned her laptop toward her mother. "I've been reading about how product companies actually work. A lot of the brands we know don't own factories." Annie frowned. "They don't?" Maya shook her head. "No. They focus on the brand, the design, and the customers. Manufacturing is done by factories that specialize in making the products." Annie leaned closer to the screen. "So how does that work?" Maya opened another article. "One model is called OEM, Original Equipment Manufacturer. The factory already knows how to make the product. You hire them to manufacture it." Annie nodded slowly. "And then?" "Another model is called Private Label." Maya scrolled down. "The factory produces the item, but your own logo and brand name go on the product." Annie looked genuinely surprised. "So customers don't even know which factory made it?" "Exactly," Maya continued reading. "There's also something called MOQ." Annie smiled. "Another new term." "Minimum order quantity," Maya explained. "It's the smallest number of units a factory is willing to produce for your first order." Annie immediately asked, "Doesn't that require a lot of money?" Maya shook her head. "Not necessarily. Many factories now work with small businesses. Some even allow relatively small trial orders before larger production runs." Annie sat quietly, processing everything she had just learned. "So let me get this straight." Maya nodded. "We don't need our own factory." "No." "We don't need expensive machines." "No." "We don't need to invent a new phone case from scratch." Maya smiled. "No, we need a good supplier, a product people like, and a brand customers can trust." Annie slowly looked back at the notebook with phone cases written across the top. For years, she had believed that building a brand required enormous factories, huge investments, and hundreds of employees. Now she was discovering that many successful companies started by partnering with manufacturers that already knew how to make the product. For the first time since leaving her old career, the idea of starting a business no longer felt impossible. It felt achievable, one careful step at a time. The next morning, Annie woke up feeling different. For the first time in months, she wasn't opening job websites or checking for interview invitations. Instead, she sat down with a notebook and opened her laptop beside Maya. "Where do we start?" Annie asked. Maya smiled. "Finding a supplier." They spent the next several hours learning how manufacturers worked. They compared factories, read customer reviews, looked at product photos, and carefully checked minimum order quantities. Annie was surprised by how much information was publicly available. "There are so many options," she said. Maya nodded. "That's actually a good thing. We can compare before choosing anyone." Annie agreed. "If we're going to build a brand, we can't rush this." By lunchtime, they had narrowed the list to 3 manufacturers that specialized in premium phone cases for small businesses. Annie clicked on the first supplier's contact page. Her finger hovered over the mouse for several seconds. "What's wrong?" Maya asked. Annie smiled nervously. "It suddenly feels real." Maya laughed. Because it is. Annie took a deep breath and clicked Contact Supplier. She introduced herself, explained that she wanted to build a new phone case brand, and asked about product quality, customization options, pricing, and sample orders. Before pressing send, she hesitated one last time. Ready? Maya asked. Annie smiled. Ready. She clicked the button. A few seconds later, the confirmation message appeared on the screen. Annie stared at it quietly. It wasn't a large investment. It wasn't a signed contract. It wasn't even an order yet. But it was the first real action she had taken toward building something of her own. That afternoon, Annie opened a fresh notebook and wrote a new heading across the first page. Brand Ideas. Beneath it, she left the page blank. Any ideas? Maya asked. Annie laughed. Not yet. She closed the notebook with a smile. One step at a time. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, Annie realized something had changed. Just a few weeks earlier, she had been waiting for someone to give her another chance. Now she was creating one for herself. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew there would be mistakes, setbacks, and lessons she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since her marriage ended, Annie wasn't looking back anymore. She was looking forward. And that made all the difference. The morning after contacting several suppliers, Annie woke up to 3 new emails in her inbox. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the first one. Instead of a simple price list, she found pages of product specifications, manufacturing options, shipping terms, and unfamiliar business terminology. She frowned. I thought they were just going to tell us how much the cases cost. Maya laughed as she pulled up a chair beside her. Looks like there's a lot more to it. Annie clicked through the documents one by one. Every answer seemed to introduce 3 new questions. One supplier asked which material she preferred. Another wanted to know whether she wanted a matte finish or a glossy finish. A third asked if she needed custom molds or existing designs. Annie rubbed her forehead. 18 years ago, my job started after the product already existed. Maya looked at her. What do you mean? Annie smiled. Back then, factories made the products. My job was to convince stores to buy them. She looked back at the screen. Now I have to understand the product before I can even sell it. Over the next few days, Annie filled an entire notebook with handwritten notes. She learned how different materials, finishes, and manufacturing choices affected both quality and cost. She also realized that building a product was only half the job. Shipping, customs, packaging, and delivery were just as important if she wanted customers to receive a product they could trust. One evening, she closed her notebook and leaned back with a tired sigh. I thought I understood this industry. Maya looked up from her laptop. You do. Annie smiled. No. She gently shook her head. I understood the industry 20 years ago. She looked at the pages filled with notes and unfamiliar terms. This is a completely different world. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had made another mistake. She had already spent months trying to return to a career that no longer existed. Now she was stepping into an industry that had changed beyond recognition. Maya noticed the uncertainty on her mother's face. Scared? Annie laughed quietly. A little. Good. Annie looked at her in surprise. Maya smiled. It means you're learning. Annie looked back at the notebook one more time before picking up her pen again. She wasn't going to pretend she already knew everything. She wasn't going to let pride stop her from asking questions. If building a business meant starting over from the beginning, then she would become a beginner again, one lesson at a time, one page at a time, one step at a time. A week later, replies from the suppliers had turned into real conversations. Annie and Maya compared every message carefully, asking about pricing, production time, materials, packaging, and shipping costs. Some suppliers answered within minutes. Others took days. One company offered the lowest price, but their communication felt rushed and vague. Another responded with detailed explanations, photos, and videos of every product Annie asked about. Price isn't everything, Annie said as she closed another email. Maya nodded. If they're difficult to work with now, they'll probably be even harder after we place an order, Annie agreed. We're choosing a partner, not just a factory. After narrowing the list to 3 manufacturers, Annie ordered sample products from each of them. Waiting turned out to be harder than she expected. Every morning, she checked the tracking numbers before making breakfast. Every afternoon, she refreshed the shipping updates. It reminded her of waiting for college acceptance letters years ago. Except this time, her future wasn't in someone else's hands. It was arriving in cardboard boxes. Nearly 2 weeks later, the first package finally appeared on their front porch. Annie carried it inside like it contained something fragile. Maya grabbed her phone. "Should we film this?" Annie laughed. "Let's make sure they're actually good first." They opened the box together. Inside were several phone cases wrapped neatly in protective sleeves. At first glance, they looked almost identical to the ones Annie had seen online. But the moment she held one in her hand, she noticed the difference. The edges felt rough. The buttons were stiff. One corner didn't fit the sample phone perfectly. Annie quietly placed it back on the table. "Looks nice in photos," she said. "Feels cheap in real life." 2 days later, the second package arrived. The material felt softer, the buttons clicked smoothly, and the camera cutout lined up perfectly. Maya smiled. "Much better." Annie nodded but continued inspecting every detail. She bent the case, checked the inside lining, examined the print quality, and looked for tiny imperfections most customers would never notice. "If we're asking people to trust our brand," she said, "we have to notice the things they don't." The final shipment arrived at the end of the week. It was the most expensive supplier they had contacted, but within seconds of opening the box, Annie understood why. The finish felt premium. The fit was precise. Even the packaging looked elegant enough to sit on a retail shelf. Maya looked at her mother. "I think we both know which one wins." Annie smiled as she held the sample in her hands one last time. It wasn't the cheapest option. It wasn't even close. But it was the first product she could proudly imagine selling under her own name. She opened her laptop, drafted one final email, and thanked the other suppliers for their time. Then she returned to the manufacturer whose sample had impressed her the most. This time, she wasn't asking questions anymore. She was ready to begin building something together. With a supplier finally chosen, Annie expected the hardest part to be over. Instead, she quickly realized they still didn't have a business. They only had a product. One evening, Maya placed the sample phone case on the kitchen table. "Now comes the important question." Annie looked up. "What's that?" Maya smiled. "Why would anyone buy our case instead of the thousands of others already online?" Annie didn't answer immediately. It was a simple question, but it forced her to think differently. She wasn't trying to become another factory. She wasn't even trying to become the cheapest seller. She was trying to build a brand. Over the next several days, the dining table disappeared beneath notebooks, color palettes, font samples, and pages filled with possible names. Some sounded too generic. Others were impossible to remember. A few looked good on paper but didn't feel right when Annie said them out loud. Every evening, they crossed out more ideas than they kept. "We're not naming a product," Annie said. "We're naming something people will hopefully remember years from now." Eventually, one name made them both stop talking. It felt simple, modern, and elegant. Maya smiled. "I didn't hate it immediately." Annie laughed. "That might be the nicest thing you've said all week." They searched online to make sure it wasn't already taken. When they found the name available, Annie quietly wrote it across the top of a clean notebook page. For the first time, their business had an identity. The following week, they designed a simple logo. Nothing flashy, nothing complicated. Annie wanted customers to remember the feeling behind the brand, not just the symbol. They chose clean typography, soft neutral colors, and minimal packaging that looked premium without feeling expensive. Maya held the sample box beside the old packaging from the factory. "It's funny," she said. "The phone case inside is almost the same." Annie smiled. "But the experience isn't." She carefully placed the case back into the new package. "People don't only buy products," Maya nodded. "They buy how those products make them feel." Annie looked around the table, covered with sketches, packaging samples, and branding notes. Months earlier, she had believed she was simply trying to sell phone cases. Now she understood she was building something much bigger. Every decision, from the logo to the packaging to the message inside the box, would tell customers who they were before they ever held the product in their hands. Annie closed the notebook and smiled with quiet satisfaction. For the first time, this no longer felt like an idea. It finally felt like a real brand. The following week, Everything they had spent months building finally came together. The supplier confirmed the first production run. The packaging was finished, the logo was printed, the product photos were ready. Annie looked around the dining table that had slowly transformed into a temporary office. A few months earlier, it had been covered with rejection letters and job applications. Now it was filled with phone cases, shipping boxes, notebooks, and a laptop displaying the homepage of their online store. Maya smiled. Ready? Annie took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. Together, they uploaded every product photo to their Shopify store. Annie carefully wrote each product description, making sure every word sounded honest instead of exaggerated. She didn't promise the world's strongest phone case or the lowest price online. She simply explained the quality, the design, and why they believed customers would enjoy using it every day. After finishing the website, they created an Instagram page for the brand, then a TikTok account. Maya spent the afternoon filming short videos showing different phone case designs while Annie answered comments and organized the product catalog. By early evening, everything was finally connected. Website, social media, payment system, shipping settings, inventory. Annie stared at the screen for several seconds before moving the mouse over one final button. Publish store. Maya looked at her mother. This is it. Annie smiled nervously. This is it. She clicked the button. Their online store was officially live. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Annie refreshed the dashboard. 0 visitors, 0 orders. Maya shrugged. It's only been a minute. Annie laughed. You're right. Over the next few days, more visitors slowly found the website. Some browsed through the collection. A few even added products to their carts. But every time Annie checked the dashboard, the number she hoped would change remained the same. 0 orders. One evening, Annie quietly closed her laptop and stared out the kitchen window. Building the website had been difficult. Finding suppliers had been difficult. Creating the brand had been difficult. But somehow, the hardest part had only just begun. She had finally opened the doors to her business. Now she had to figure out how to convince someone to walk inside. The first week passed without a single sale. Annie told herself it was normal. Every new business needed time. She kept posting on Instagram, uploaded short videos to TikTok, and shared behind-the-scenes photos of the brand they had spent months creating. A few people liked the posts. Some left encouraging comments. Others followed the account. But none of them became customers. Maybe we just need more traffic, Maya said one evening. Annie nodded. Then let's try advertising. She spent the next several days learning the basics of online ads. Audience targeting, daily budgets, click-through rates, cost per click. Every lesson reminded her how different business had become. Back when she worked in sales, success came from shaking hands, visiting stores, and building relationships face-to-face. Now, customers were reached through algorithms she couldn't even see. Annie launched her first campaign with a small budget. She watched the dashboard throughout the day as visitors began arriving on the website. 10 visitors became 50. 50 became over 100. Annie smiled with cautious optimism. People are finally finding us. Maya refreshed the store dashboard. Still no orders. Annie tried another advertisement with different photos, then another with a different audience. She rewrote product descriptions, changed headlines, adjusted prices, and even redesigned the homepage. Every change brought another wave of visitors. Every evening ended the same way. 0 new orders. One afternoon, Annie opened the advertising report and quietly stared at the total amount they had spent. It wasn't enough to ruin them financially, but it was enough to make her stomach tighten. She slowly closed the laptop without saying a word. Maya noticed immediately. Mom? Annie forced a smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Maybe those companies were right. Maya frowned. What companies? Annie looked down at her hands. The ones that interviewed me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe I'm too old to start over. The kitchen fell silent. For months, Annie had carried herself with determination, refusing to let rejection define her. Now, for the first time, Maya could hear genuine doubt in her mother's voice. She walked across the room and sat beside her. Do you remember what you told me when I was little? Annie looked up. Maya smiled softly. You used to say that failing once doesn't mean you're a failure. It only means one approach didn't work. Annie laughed quietly through tired eyes. I really said that? More than once. Maya reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. So why are you giving yourself less patience than you gave me? Annie looked around at the sample products, the packaging, the notebooks filled with ideas, and the brand they had built from nothing. They had come too far to quit because the first attempt hadn't worked. She took a long breath before opening the laptop again. One more try, she said. But this time, we're going to figure out what our customers actually want instead of guessing. Maya smiled. Now that sounds like the mom I know. The next morning, Annie stopped changing everything. Instead of rewriting the website again, she and Maya spent hours reading customer reviews from successful phone case brands. They noticed the same pattern over and over. People rarely talked about technical specifications. They talked about how the case felt in their hands, how it matched their style, and how it made them feel more confident carrying their phones every day. Annie closed one review and smiled. We've been selling features. Maya nodded. But customers are buying emotions. Together, they rewrote the product pages. They replaced technical language with simple, honest descriptions. Maya filmed new videos showing everyday moments instead of close-up product shots. Annie began sharing the story behind the brand instead of treating it like another online store. They weren't pretending to be a giant company anymore. They were simply introducing themselves. A few days later, Annie was making breakfast when Maya suddenly shouted from the dining room, "Mom!" Annie rushed in, thinking something had gone wrong. Maya pointed at the laptop screen with both hands. Neither of them spoke for a second. In the corner of the Shopify dashboard, a small notification had appeared. New order. Annie blinked several times, convinced she was reading it incorrectly. Refresh it, she whispered. Maya refreshed the page. The notification was still there. One customer, one phone case. Annie slowly clicked on the order details. A woman from North Carolina had purchased one of their best-selling designs at full price. No discount code, no special promotion. Just a normal customer choosing their product over thousands of others online. Annie lowered herself into the chair without taking her eyes off the screen. Maya laughed and wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders. We did it. Annie didn't answer. Tears quietly filled her eyes. This wasn't a life-changing amount of money. It wasn't enough to pay the mortgage. It wasn't enough to replace the income she had lost after the divorce. But none of that mattered. She wiped away a tear and smiled through the emotion. Do you know why I'm crying? Maya gently shook her head. Annie looked back at the order confirmation. Because this is the first time in almost 20 years, she paused as her voice trembled, that someone has paid for something I built with my own hands. Maya hugged her tighter. Annie closed her eyes for a moment and let herself feel everything she had carried over the past 2 years. The rejection, the heartbreak, the fear, the loneliness, and the doubt. None of it disappeared because of one small order. But that single notification proved something she had almost stopped believing. She wasn't finished. She wasn't too old. And she was capable of building a future that belonged entirely to her. The first order was small. The confidence it gave her was priceless. The first order was followed by another 2 days later, then another at the end of the week. None of them were large, but each notification filled Annie with the same excitement she had felt the first time. She carefully packed every phone case herself, folded the thank you card by hand, and checked each package twice before sealing the box. I still can't believe people are actually buying from us, she said as she placed another shipping label on a package. Maya smiled. They're not buying from a giant company anymore. They're buying from us. As the weeks passed, the number of orders slowly increased. Some days they shipped only one package. Other days they shipped 4 or 5. The business wasn't making much money yet, but it was finally moving forward. Annie believed the hardest part was behind them. She was wrong. One afternoon, she opened the latest inventory report and frowned. Several popular designs had only a handful of units remaining. We're almost out of stock already, she said. Maya walked over to the table. That's a good problem, isn't it? Annie nodded. Only if we can replace them fast enough. She contacted their supplier that evening, asking about a small reorder. The reply arrived the next morning. Annie read the email twice before sighing. What's wrong? Maya asked. Annie turned the screen toward her. The price only stays this low if we order at least 500 units. Maya's smile faded. What if we order fewer? Annie clicked on the updated quotation. The unit price increased dramatically. After adding shipping and import costs, their profit on each phone case would almost disappear. Annie leaned back in her chair. Small orders keep our risk low. She paused before pointing at the spreadsheet. But they also make the business almost impossible to grow. Maya studied the numbers for several minutes. What if we order more? Annie didn't answer immediately. She already knew what that meant. Hundreds of phone cases sitting in their home, thousands of dollars tied up in inventory, money they couldn't easily recover if the products didn't sell. She quietly looked around the dining room. Boxes already occupied one corner of the space. Another large shipment would leave almost no room to walk. This is the part nobody talks about, Annie said softly. People tell you how to make sales. They don't tell you what happens after the sales start. Maya looked at the supplier's quotation one more time. If we don't order enough, we'll lose our best-selling products. Annie nodded. And if we order too much, we'll be stuck with inventory we might never sell. The room fell silent. Neither option felt safe. Annie opened their savings spreadsheet and stared at the remaining balance. It represented years of careful budgeting after the divorce. Once she spent it, there would be no easy way to replace it. Finally, she closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and reached for the keyboard. If we're serious about building a real business, she said quietly, we can't keep thinking like we're just testing an idea. Maya nodded without saying a word. Annie confirmed the order for their first large production run. The confirmation email arrived a few seconds later. It was the biggest financial decision she had made since leaving Thomas. And there was no turning back now. The large shipment arrived 2 weeks later. Annie and Maya spent an entire afternoon unpacking boxes and organizing inventory by phone model and color. Seeing hundreds of neatly stacked phone cases filled Annie with pride. Their small dining room had officially become a warehouse. Look at this, Annie said with a smile. A few months ago, all we had was an idea. Maya looked around at the shelves lined with products. Now we have a real business. Annie picked up one of her favorite designs. It featured elegant floral artwork in soft pastel colors with delicate gold accents around the edges. She smiled. I think this one's going to be our best seller. Maya looked at it for a few seconds before forcing an awkward smile. It's pretty. Annie immediately noticed the hesitation. What? Maya carefully chose her words. Mom, can I be honest? Annie laughed. I'd rather you be honest now than after we sell 1,000 of them. Maya picked up the case and turned it over in her hands. Nobody my age would buy this. Annie blinked. Really? Maya shook her head. It looks like something you'd find in a gift shop 10 or 15 years ago. Annie frowned. But styles like this sold incredibly well when I was in the business. Maya smiled gently. Back then, the room became quiet. Maya opened TikTok and began scrolling through videos. Then she switched to Instagram and showed Annie dozens of trending phone case brands. Clean designs, neutral colors, bold graphics, minimalist artwork, playful illustrations, limited edition collaborations. Trends changed almost every week. People don't just buy protection anymore, Maya explained. Phone cases have become part of someone's outfit. People match them with their clothes, their bags, even their mood. Annie continued watching the screen without saying a word. The products she had confidently chosen suddenly looked outdated beside the newer designs. And trends move incredibly fast now, Maya continued. Something that's popular today might be forgotten 3 months from now. Annie slowly placed her favorite sample back on the table. I've been choosing products based on customers I used to know. Maya nodded softly. Annie looked around at the hundreds of cases stacked neatly inside their home. Every purchasing decision had come from experience she had trusted for nearly 2 decades. But experience alone wasn't enough anymore. The market had moved on while she was busy raising a family. She smiled, though there was disappointment behind it. I guess I've been designing for customers who don't exist anymore. Maya reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. Not anymore. Annie looked back at the shelves one last time before opening her notebook. She drew a line through several future product ideas and started a brand new page. At the top, she wrote 3 simple words. Know your customer. If they wanted this business to survive, Annie realized she would have to stop selling to the past and start understanding the people buying today. Annie refused to blame the market for her slow sales. The problem wasn't that people didn't want phone cases. The problem was that she hadn't fully understood what they wanted. Over the next few weeks, she and Maya began searching for new manufacturers instead of relying on the one they had started with. Every evening after dinner, the dining table became an office again. Supplier catalogs covered one side of the table, while sample cases covered the other. Annie compared prices, materials, production times, shipping costs, and customer reviews. Maya focused on communication. "This company takes 3 days to answer one email," she said. Annie crossed another name off the list. "If they're this slow before we pay them, imagine what happens afterward." They requested quotations from several new factories. Some were cheaper, but refused to customize small orders. Others had beautiful product photos, but poor online reviews. One supplier stood out almost immediately. Their replies arrived within hours. Every question Annie asked received detailed answers with photos, videos, and quality reports. They even suggested small improvements to her designs instead of simply taking the order. Annie looked impressed. "They're acting like they actually want us to succeed." Maya smiled. "That's a good sign." Before making another commitment, Annie ordered a fresh set of samples. A week later, the package arrived. She opened the box carefully, remembering the disappointment of previous shipments. This time, the moment she picked up the first phone case, she noticed the difference. The material felt stronger. The buttons clicked smoothly. The print was sharper, and every edge looked perfectly finished. Maya inspected another sample beside her. "These are even better than our current ones." Annie nodded in agreement. They spent the next 2 hours examining every detail they could think of. They tested the fit on different phones, checked the camera cutouts, bent the corners, and compared the colors under different lighting. For the first time, Annie struggled to find anything worth criticizing. She smiled with quiet relief. "This is the quality I wanted from the beginning." The supplier's quotation wasn't the cheapest, but it was fair. More importantly, Annie trusted them. She remembered the lesson she had learned from her years in sales. The lowest price rarely created the strongest business relationship. Reliability was worth paying for. 2 days later, Annie signed the purchase order for a new production run. It was larger than anything they had ordered before. As she clicked confirm, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Maybe this shipment would finally give their brand the quality it deserved. Maybe this was the turning point they had been waiting for. Annie closed her laptop with a smile, believing they had finally found the right partner. She had no idea that the biggest setback of her journey was already on its way. 3 weeks later, the freight truck finally arrived. Annie signed the delivery receipt with a smile she hadn't worn in days. This shipment represented the biggest investment they had made since launching the business. If everything looked as good as the samples, they were finally ready to move forward with confidence. "Help me bring these inside," Annie called. Maya hurried over, and together they carried box after box into the dining room. By the time they finished, the space looked more like a small warehouse than a family home. Annie reached for a box cutter. "Moment of truth." Maya smiled. "I've been waiting for this." Annie carefully sliced through the tape and opened the first carton. Dozens of neatly packed phone cases sat inside. At first glance, everything looked fine. She picked one up, turned it over in her hands, and frowned. "That's strange." Maya looked over. "What?" Annie ran her thumb across the back of the case. The surface felt rougher than the sample they had approved. She picked up the original sample from the shelf and compared them side by side. The difference was obvious. This isn't the same material. Maya took both cases and immediately noticed it too. "The sample feels softer." Annie opened another package. Every case felt exactly the same. She pressed one of the side buttons. It barely moved before slowly popping back into place. Annie's smile disappeared. "Open another box." Maya quickly did as she was told. The next carton revealed even more problems. Several printed designs were slightly off-center. One case had a tiny scratch across the back, while another had glue residue around the camera cutout. Annie's heartbeat quickened. "No." As they checked more boxes, new defects kept appearing. Some camera openings weren't perfectly aligned, and a few corners showed small gaps where the material hadn't been finished properly. Then Annie opened one sealed package and immediately wrinkled her nose. "Do you smell that?" Maya leaned closer. A strong plastic odor escaped from the box. Neither of them needed to say anything. They both knew customers would notice it immediately. Annie sat down without a word. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Maya opened the supplier's photos from the original sample approval. The products on the screen looked flawless. The products covering their dining table looked nothing like them. Annie quickly emailed the supplier with photos of every defect they had found. Hours later, the reply finally arrived. The factory apologized for the inconvenience, but insisted the products were within acceptable manufacturing standards. Since the order had already been completed and shipped internationally, they would not accept a return or issue a full refund. Annie read the message twice before lowering her phone onto the table. "They're refusing." Maya stared at her. "After everything?" Annie nodded slowly. Nearly all of the payment had already been transferred before production began. The shipment had crossed an ocean. The money was gone. Around them sat hundreds of phone cases that carried their brand's name but fell far below the quality they had promised themselves they would sell. Annie looked across the room at the stacks of unopened boxes. They weren't looking at inventory anymore. They were looking at the most expensive mistake they had made since starting the business. At first, Annie hoped the problems weren't as serious as they seemed. She carefully inspected every phone case before shipping it, setting aside the worst ones and keeping only the pieces that looked acceptable. "Maybe most customers won't notice," she said quietly, more to convince herself than Maya. For a few days, everything seemed fine. The remaining orders were shipped, and Annie tried to focus on moving forward. Then the first email arrived. A customer politely explained that the buttons on the case felt stiff and asked if they had received a defective item. Annie immediately apologized and issued a refund without asking the customer to return it. "One bad product doesn't define us," she told Maya. But the second complaint came the next day. Then another. Soon, customers were reporting the same problems Annie had discovered herself. Buttons felt stiff, were. Printed designs peeled after only a few days. Camera openings didn't line up correctly, and some customers even complained about the strong plastic smell. Annie read every message herself. She never argued. She never blamed shipping. She never accused customers of exaggerating. Deep down, she knew they were telling the truth. Before long, one-star reviews began appearing publicly. "Looks nothing like the sample photos. Cheap quality. I wanted to support a small business, but I'm disappointed." Every notification felt heavier than the one before. Annie refunded order after order, watching the business account shrink with every click. The money they had worked so hard to earn disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Worse still, new orders began slowing down. Their products no longer appeared as often in search results, and fewer people visited the website each day. Annie didn't need anyone to explain why. Poor reviews were damaging the reputation they had spent months trying to build. One evening, she walked into the dining room and quietly looked around. On one side of the room sat the first inventory they had ordered good quality products, but expensive enough to leave almost no profit after shipping and advertising. On the other side stood stacks of the newer shipment, the one with lower costs, but unacceptable quality. Neither pile felt like an asset anymore. One was too expensive to scale. The other was impossible to sell with a clear conscience. Maya walked in and found her mother standing silently between the two stacks of boxes. "What are you thinking?" Annie looked around the room before answering. "I've somehow managed to end up with two warehouses." Maya frowned. Annie gave a tired smile. "One full of products we can barely afford to sell." She looked toward the second pile. "And one full of products we shouldn't sell at all." For the first time since launching the business, Annie wasn't worrying about making more sales. She was wondering whether the business could survive at all. The house grew quiet after midnight, but Annie was still awake. She sat alone at the dining table with a calculator, a notebook, and a stack of unpaid invoices spread out in front of her. The only sound in the room came from the ticking kitchen clock. She entered the same numbers over and over, hoping they would somehow produce a different answer. They never did. Every refund drained the business account a little further, while every unopened box in the corner represented money she could no longer use. Annie rubbed her tired eyes and looked around the room. Just months earlier, this table had been covered with sketches and dreams about building a new future. Now it was buried beneath invoices, receipts, and spreadsheets filled with red numbers. She quietly closed the notebook and rested her head in her hands. Sleep had become almost impossible. Every night, she replayed every decision she had made since starting the business. Should she have ordered fewer units? Should she have trusted that supplier? Should she have listened to Maya sooner about changing the designs? The questions never stopped. One evening, Maya walked into the kitchen for a glass of water and froze when she saw the light still on. Annie was sitting exactly where she had been before Maya went to bed. "Mom, you haven't slept yet?" Annie forced a smile. "I just wanted to finish checking a few things." Maya glanced at the notebook. It wasn't business planning anymore. Annie had written the same calculations several times across different pages, as if repeating them might somehow erase the losses. Maya quietly sat beside her. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight." Annie stared at the table for a long moment before speaking. "I keep thinking about one thing." Maya waited. Annie's voice was barely above a whisper. "None of this would have happened if I hadn't asked you to do this with me." Maya immediately shook her head. "Mom, don't." Annie continued anyway. "You believed in me without asking for proof. You spent months helping me build this business." She looked toward the stacks of unsold inventory. "And what do you have to show for it?" Maya reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I chose to be here." Annie's eyes filled with tears. "I was supposed to protect you." Maya squeezed her hand even tighter. "You did." Annie looked at her in confusion. Maya smiled softly. "You taught me that it's okay to try something difficult, even when it hurts." The room fell silent again. Annie looked around at the bills, the damaged inventory, and the business that seemed to be falling apart faster than she could save it. For the first time since this journey had begun, she allowed herself to think the words she had been trying so hard to ignore. Maybe I really am too old to start over. The thought frightened her more than the unpaid bills, more than the bad reviews, and more than the money she had lost. Because if it was true, then everything she had fought to build over the past year might already be over before it had truly begun. For nearly 2 weeks, Maya watched her mother disappear a little more each day. Annie barely touched her meals. She stayed awake long after midnight, surrounded by invoices and inventory reports, only to wake up a few hours later and do it all again. Every morning, she insisted she was fine. Every night, Maya found another light still on somewhere in the house. One Saturday morning, Annie poured herself a cup of coffee but never took a sip. She simply stared through the kitchen window, lost in thought. "Mom?" Maya called softly. Annie blinked and forced a smile. "Sorry. What were you saying?" Maya looked at her for a long moment before quietly shaking her head. "Nothing." The answer worried her even more. That afternoon, Annie locked herself in the dining room again, determined to find a solution hidden somewhere inside another spreadsheet. Maya stood outside the door for several seconds before walking back to her bedroom. She opened her phone and stared at her father's contact information. Months earlier, Annie had made her promise never to involve Thomas in the business. "This is my responsibility," she had said. "I don't want your father feeling like he has to rescue me," Maya had promised. She meant it. But the woman inside the dining room no longer looked like the mother she knew. After nearly 10 minutes of hesitation, Maya finally pressed call. Thomas answered almost immediately. "Hey, sweetheart." Maya didn't know how to begin. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Thomas's voice became more serious. "What's wrong?" Maya looked toward the closed dining room door. "It's Mom." There was another brief silence. "Is she okay?" Maya slowly shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. "No." Her voice trembled. "She says she's fine, but she's not sleeping anymore." Thomas listened without interrupting as Maya explained everything. The defective shipment, the refunds, the one-star reviews, the boxes filling the dining room, the nights Annie spent calculating numbers until sunrise. When she finished, Thomas remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, he spoke. "Thank you for telling me." Maya closed her eyes. "I broke my promise." Thomas understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes keeping a promise hurts the person you're trying to protect. The following afternoon, Thomas asked Maya to meet him at Sweet Memory, the small ice cream shop they used to visit as a family years ago. It had been a long time since either of them had sat at the same corner table. Thomas ordered 2 ice creams without asking, one bear-shaped, one lion-shaped. Maya smiled sadly when she saw them. You remembered. Thomas looked at the 2 small desserts before answering quietly. I never forgot. For the next hour, Maya told him everything Annie had been hiding. Not just the financial problems, but the fear, the guilt, and the way she blamed herself for dragging Maya into the business. Thomas listened without checking his phone once. When Maya finally finished, he stared silently through the shop window for a long time. The woman who had once given up her own career so he could build his was now carrying a burden she refused to let anyone else share. He slowly stood up, placed a few bills on the table, and picked up his coat. Dad? Maya asked. Thomas looked at his daughter with quiet determination. It's time I talk to your mother. The next evening, Annie heard the doorbell just as she finished organizing another stack of inventory reports. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the front door, she froze. Thomas stood quietly on the porch with his hands in his pockets. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Annie was the first to break the silence. What are you doing here? Thomas answered honestly. I came to see you. Annie immediately understood. She turned toward the living room. Maya. Maya slowly stepped out from the hallway, unable to meet her mother's eyes. Annie's face fell. You told him. Maya whispered. I'm sorry. Annie closed her eyes and took a slow breath. We had an agreement. I know. I asked you not to involve him. Maya nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. I know, but I couldn't keep watching you disappear. Annie wanted to say something, but the words never came. The silence between them was broken by Thomas. Don't blame her. Annie looked at him sharply. This isn't your business anymore. Thomas didn't argue. You're right. He paused. But Maya is still our daughter. Annie folded her arms. If you're here because you feel sorry for me, you can leave. Thomas shook his head. I'm not here because I pity you. Annie waited. I'm here because I know what it looks like when someone carries too much alone. Annie laughed quietly, though there wasn't any humor in it. That's interesting coming from you. Thomas accepted the comment without defending himself. Probably. The room became quiet again. Finally, Thomas looked toward the dining table covered with invoices, refund receipts, and notebooks. Can I see everything? Annie frowned. Why? Because I want to understand what's happening before I say anything. Annie shook her head. There's nothing to understand. I made bad decisions. End of story. Thomas looked at her calmly. Businesses don't collapse because of one bad decision. Annie didn't answer. They usually collapse because several small problems start feeding each other. Annie stared at him for a long moment. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave. Another part was simply too exhausted to argue anymore. Thomas spoke again, his voice steady. I'm not here to fix our marriage. Annie looked up. I'm not asking for another chance. He paused before continuing. I'm asking for 6 months. Annie frowned. 6 months? Let me help you rebuild the business. Annie immediately shook her head. I don't need your money. Good, Thomas replied, because that's not what I'm offering. Annie looked confused. Thomas continued. You don't need an investor. You need someone who can help you identify what's broken and build a system that actually works. Annie looked away without speaking. Thomas took one final step toward the dining table. Give me 6 months. If the business is in a better place, I'll walk away knowing you don't need me anymore. If we fail, he shrugged gently, then at least you'll know you tried everything. Annie remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked toward Maya, who was watching them anxiously from across the room. Then she looked back at Thomas. 6 months, she said quietly. Business only. Thomas nodded once. Business only. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But for the first time since the business began falling apart, Annie no longer felt like she was carrying the entire weight alone. The following morning, Thomas arrived carrying nothing but a laptop and a notebook. Annie expected him to spend a few minutes offering advice before leaving. Instead, he sat down at the dining table and looked around the room. I need everything, he said. Annie frowned. Everything? Sales reports, supplier invoices, refunds, inventory, customer reviews, everything. Annie quietly pulled stack after stack of documents from drawers and shelves. Within minutes, the dining table disappeared beneath spreadsheets, receipts, notebooks, and shipping records. Thomas opened his laptop without saying another word. For nearly 2 hours, the only sounds in the room were keyboard clicks and pages turning. Annie watched impatiently. Well, Thomas finally closed one spreadsheet. Your business isn't failing because people don't want the product. Annie folded her arms. Then why is it failing? Thomas turned the laptop toward her. Your designs improved after Maya helped you understand younger customers. The real problem is your supply chain. Every time poor quality inventory arrives, everything else collapses. Refunds increase, reviews fall, customers lose trust, and eventually your cash flow disappears. Annie slowly nodded. She had been treating every problem separately. Thomas was showing her how they were connected. I kept trying to fix the symptoms, she admitted quietly. Instead of the cause, Thomas finished. Annie looked down at the supplier invoices. So we need a better factory, a better manufacturing partner, Thomas corrected. You've been buying through trading companies. Every middleman between you and the factory reduces your control over quality. If you want consistent products, you need to work directly with the people making them. Maya looked up from the other side of the table. Can we even do that? Thomas smiled slightly. Yes. Annie looked at him. How? Thomas closed his laptop. We go to the source. Annie waited. China. The room became quiet. Annie had never traveled overseas for business. The idea sounded far beyond anything she had imagined when she first decided to sell phone cases from her dining room. You mean, actually visit the factories? Thomas nodded. Walk through them. Meet the owners. See the production lines. Ask questions face to face. Annie stared at him for several seconds. It sounded intimidating. It also sounded like exactly what she should have done from the beginning. She took a slow breath before asking the only question left. When do we leave? Thomas smiled for the first time that day. As soon as we're ready. Once Annie agreed to visit the factories, everything started moving much faster than she expected. Thomas didn't begin searching the internet himself. Instead, he made a single phone call to his executive assistant. I need a short list of reliable OEM phone case manufacturers, he said. Only factories with a proven export history, stable quality control, and experience working with international brands. By the following afternoon, detailed reports had already arrived in his inbox. Each factory had been researched, with its production capacity, certifications, major clients, product categories, and customer feedback summarized into a clear report. Annie stared at the documents in disbelief. I spent weeks trying to figure this out by myself. Thomas nodded. Businesses don't grow because one person knows everything. They grow because people work together. Over the next several days, Thomas's team contacted every factory on the shortlist, arranged video meetings, confirmed production managers' availability, and scheduled factory tours before anyone booked a flight. Annie watched the process unfold with fascination. You don't just show up and hope someone lets you walk through the factory? Thomas laughed. Definitely not. William, one of Thomas's international sourcing specialists, joined the planning meetings through video calls. Fluent in both English and Mandarin, he would serve as their interpreter during the trip and help negotiate directly with the manufacturers. Annie laughed nervously. That's probably a good idea. While the meetings were being arranged, Annie prepared herself. She read about manufacturing, watched videos explaining production lines, and filled another notebook with questions she wanted to ask. Every evening, she practiced unfamiliar terms aloud. Polycarbonate, injection molding, quality inspection, production lead time. Maya watched from across the table. You're studying harder than I ever did for college exams. Annie smiled. That's because this exam costs a lot more if I fail. A week later, their passports, visas, flight tickets, hotel reservations, factory schedules, and transportation plans were all confirmed. Thomas's assistant emailed everyone a detailed itinerary covering every meeting from the moment they landed until the day they returned home. Annie looked through the schedule one last time. Just a year earlier, she had been hoping someone would give her another job interview. Now she was preparing to fly halfway around the world to negotiate directly with manufacturers. Early the next morning, Annie locked the front door, picked up her suitcase, and looked back at the house for a brief moment. Maya smiled as she loaded the luggage into the car. Ready? Annie took a deep breath. This journey wasn't just about finding a better supplier anymore. It was about proving, to herself more than anyone else, that her story wasn't ending with failure. She smiled, climbed into the car beside Thomas, and together they headed toward the airport. After nearly 16 hours of flights and layovers, Annie stepped out of the airport into a city unlike anything she had ever seen. Towering buildings stretched across the skyline, while highways wound between rows of modern factories. Everything felt larger, faster, and more organized than she had imagined. "This doesn't look anything like the factories I pictured," she admitted. Thomas smiled. "Most people imagine old warehouses." William laughed. "You're about to see something very different." Early the next morning, the three of them arrived at their first factory. Annie stopped walking as the massive facility came into view. Hundreds of employees moved between production areas while automated lines produced and packaged phone cases with remarkable precision. She quickly realized that manufacturing wasn't just about machines. It was about systems, consistency, and quality control. Every few minutes, she added another note to her notebook. During one meeting, the factory manager asked what material they wanted. Annie hesitated. "Poly?" She looked helplessly at Thomas. "Poly?" Thomas smiled. "Polycarbonate?" Annie laughed, embarrassed. "I knew that." A little later, she misunderstood a question about minimum order quantities, and William quietly clarified it before translating her answer. "That's why William is here," Thomas said with a chuckle. Annie laughed with them, feeling the tension she had carried since arriving slowly disappear. As they visited more factories over the next 3 days, Annie grew noticeably more confident. She began asking her own questions about production methods, quality inspections, and lead times, while William translated each conversation. She also found herself paying close attention to the way Thomas negotiated. He listened carefully, challenged vague answers, and always asked for evidence instead of accepting promises. Watching him earn respect without ever raising his voice gave Annie an entirely new appreciation for the career he had built. Not every factory was the right fit. Some looked impressive but couldn't meet their quality standards. Others produced excellent products but required order volumes far beyond what Annie's business could afford. Late on the third afternoon, they walked into one final factory. Almost immediately, Annie sensed something different. The production manager spoke honestly about both the factory's strengths and its limitations. There were no exaggerated promises, only clear answers backed by real production records. When Annie asked difficult questions, they answered each one patiently instead of avoiding them. As they left the meeting room, Thomas glanced toward her. "What do you think?" Annie looked back through the glass wall at the production floor one last time before smiling. "I think we've finally found the right partner." The following morning, Annie, Thomas, and William returned to the factory one final time. This visit wasn't about asking questions anymore. It was about making a decision. The factory manager welcomed them into a conference room where the final quotation, production schedule, and quality control agreement had already been prepared. Annie carefully read every page instead of rushing to the last line. A few months earlier, she would have focused almost entirely on price. Now she paid just as much attention to inspection standards, material specifications, delivery timelines, and communication procedures. She paused before signing anything. "I'd like production samples from every new design before mass manufacturing begins," she said. William translated. The factory manager immediately agreed. Annie continued, "And I want quality inspection photos before the shipment leaves the factory." Again, the answer was yes. Thomas smiled quietly. He didn't say a word. Annie was already asking the right questions on her own. After one final review, she picked up the pen and signed the agreement. The factory manager reached across the table to shake her hand. "We're looking forward to working together," William translated. Annie smiled. "So are we." Before leaving, they walked through the production floor one last time. This time, Annie wasn't overwhelmed by unfamiliar machines or technical terms. She recognized each stage of production and imagined her own brand moving through those same lines in just a few weeks. Outside the factory, Thomas walked over beside her. "How are you feeling?" Annie thought for a moment. "When I came here, I thought I was looking for a factory." She smiled softly. I was actually looking for confidence. Thomas nodded. Did you find it? Annie looked back at the building one last time. I think I found something even better. What's that? A fresh start. William called out that it was time to leave for the airport. Annie took one last look at the place that had changed far more than her supply chain. It had changed the way she saw herself. As the car pulled away, she rested her head against the window and watched the factory disappear into the distance. The hardest part of the journey wasn't over yet. In many ways, it was only beginning. But this time, she wasn't afraid to keep moving forward. 3 weeks after returning from China, the first shipment from their new manufacturing partner finally arrived. Annie stood quietly in the dining room as she opened the first carton. She immediately picked up one of the phone cases and smiled. The material felt exactly like the approved sample. The buttons clicked perfectly. The print was sharp. The finish was smooth. She opened several more boxes. Every product matched the quality they had promised. Annie let out a long breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "This is it," she whispered. Thomas picked up another case and inspected it carefully before handing it back with a satisfied nod. "This is the quality your customers deserve," Annie smiled, "and the quality our brand deserves." Over the next 2 days, Annie replaced every product photo on the website, updated the descriptions, and quietly relaunched the collection. This time, she didn't make a big announcement. She simply wanted the products to speak for themselves. Then she waited. The first few days passed without a single order. Annie tried not to refresh the dashboard every few minutes, but every notification still made her heart race before ending in disappointment. Thomas noticed, but didn't say anything. He knew waiting was part of the journey. On the morning of the 4th day, Annie was arranging products on a shelf when she heard Maya's voice from the living room. "Mom?" Annie looked up. Maya was staring at the laptop screen. "Come here." Annie walked over, trying not to expect too much. Then she saw it. New order. She froze. Thomas quietly walked into the room behind her as Annie clicked the notification. A customer had ordered one phone case from the new collection. She refreshed the page once, just to make sure. The order was still there. It was real. Annie slowly covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Thomas smiled before she even looked at him. Somehow, he looked happier than she did. Maya laughed. "Dad, why are you smiling like you just won the lottery?" Thomas kept his eyes on Annie. "Because this order means more than selling one phone case." Annie wiped away a tear and looked at him. Thomas smiled softly. "It means you were right not to give up." Annie couldn't stop crying. This wasn't because of the money. The profit from one order wouldn't change their lives. This customer would receive a product that truly reflected the brand Annie wanted to build. There were no shortcuts, no compromises, just honest work finally reaching the right person. A few minutes later, another notification appeared, then another later that afternoon. They weren't enough to call the business successful, but they were real customers choosing their products because they wanted them, not because of discounts or luck. That evening, Thomas closed Annie's laptop before she could refresh the dashboard again. She looked at him in surprise. "What are you doing?" Thomas smiled. "We're going out." Annie laughed. "For what?" He picked up his car keys. "To celebrate." Annie shook her head. "We only sold a few phone cases." Thomas smiled as he held the front door open for her. "Exactly." Thomas drove across town without telling anyone where they were going. Annie assumed he had chosen one of their favorite neighborhood restaurants. Instead, the car stopped beneath the entrance of one of the city's most elegant steakhouses. A valet opened Annie's door before she reached for the handle. She looked up at the building, then turned to Thomas in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding." Thomas smiled. "What?" Annie laughed. "This place?" He shrugged. "I heard the steaks are pretty good." Annie shook her head. "They're also incredibly expensive." Thomas simply offered his arm. "Come on." As they walked inside, Annie glanced down at her outfit. "I wasn't exactly dressed for a place like this." Thomas looked at her without hesitation. "You look beautiful." Annie smiled. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." The hostess guided them to a quiet table overlooking the city skyline. Over dinner, they talked about everything except work. Maya shared funny stories from her office, and Annie laughed until tears formed in her eyes as Thomas described a disastrous board meeting that had somehow ended with everyone ordering pizza. For the first time in what felt like years, The conversation wasn't about bills, suppliers, refunds, or problems waiting to be solved. It was simply a family enjoying dinner together. When the waiter placed the check on the table, Annie glanced at it without thinking. Her eyes immediately widened. "Thomas?" He looked up calmly. "What?" Annie turned the receipt toward him. "This dinner costs almost $5,000. Thomas nodded. "About that," Annie laughed. "Do you realize that's more than I've made from all my first orders combined?" "I do," she stared at him. "You've officially spent more celebrating my business than my business has earned." Thomas smiled, reached across the table, and gently took her hand. "Annie," she looked into his eyes, "I'm not celebrating these orders." She stayed silent. "I'm celebrating the woman who finally found herself again." Annie felt her smile slowly disappear as emotion filled her eyes. Thomas continued quietly. "When we divorced, you believed your life was over. You thought your best years were behind you. You doubted yourself every single day." He squeezed her hand gently. "But look at you now. You learned an entirely new industry. You built a brand from nothing. You flew halfway around the world because you refused to settle for average. And today," he smiled with unmistakable pride, "someone you've never met chose something you created." Annie felt tears gathering in her eyes again. This wasn't about a few phone cases. It wasn't about profit. It wasn't even about the business anymore. For the first time in years, someone wasn't praising her because she had been a good wife or a devoted mother. Thomas was proud of the person she had become. He lifted his glass. "To new beginnings." Maya immediately raised hers. "To Mom." Annie smiled through her tears as she picked up her own glass. "To second chances." Their glasses touched softly above the table. In that quiet moment, Annie finally believed something she hadn't allowed herself to believe since the day her marriage had ended. She wasn't rebuilding the life she had lost. She was creating one that was entirely her own. The next morning, Annie woke up before sunrise out of habit. Before making coffee, she opened her Shopify dashboard. One new order had arrived overnight. She smiled quietly, printed the shipping label, slipped a handwritten thank you card into the box, and carefully packed the phone case herself. It wasn't glamorous work, but she enjoyed every second of it. After years of helping build other people's dreams, she was finally building one of her own. Over the following weeks, the orders arrived little by little. Some mornings there were none. Other days, her phone buzzed several times before dinner. The numbers were still small, but unlike before, they kept coming. More importantly, the customers were happy. Instead of refund requests, Annie began receiving messages that made her smile. "The quality is amazing. Exactly like the pictures. It fits perfectly. I'll definitely order again." She read every review at least twice, sometimes reading them aloud to Maya, who laughed every time Annie reacted as though she had just won an award. One evening, Thomas found Annie smiling at her phone. "Another order?" he asked. Annie shook her head. "Even better." She handed him a 5-star review from one of her earliest customers, complete with photos of the phone case in everyday use. Thomas smiled. "That's worth more than an advertisement." Annie nodded. "It means someone actually loves what I made." Months passed, and the first production run gradually sold out. Standing in the garage and looking at the empty shelves where dozens of boxes had once been stacked, Annie remembered wondering if she would ever sell them all. Without hesitation, she placed a second order with the factory in China. This time, she knew exactly what materials, packaging, and quality standards she wanted, and the factory already understood her expectations. While waiting for the shipment, Annie continued talking with customers, collecting feedback, and improving her designs. When the new products arrived, she uploaded them to the website and quietly returned to packing orders instead of constantly refreshing the sales dashboard. Before long, something surprising happened. Customers who had purchased months earlier began returning. Some ordered different colors. Others bought matching cases for family members or friends. One afternoon, Annie pointed excitedly at her computer. "Thomas, look!" He walked over. "What is it?" Annie smiled. "Remember Emily? She was one of our first customers." Thomas nodded. "She just placed another order." Thomas grinned. "That's the best kind of customer." Annie smiled back. "She's not buying because she saw an ad anymore. She's buying because she trusts us." As the months passed, The garage slowly transformed into a real fulfillment space. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with inventory, packing supplies, and shipping materials. Every afternoon, Annie packed the day's orders before driving them to the courier herself. It wasn't a large business, and it wasn't making headlines, but it was steady, honest, growing one customer at a time. One evening, after finishing another stack of shipments, Annie looked around the crowded garage. There was barely enough room left to move between the shelves. Thomas walked in carrying another carton of packing supplies. "What are you thinking?" Annie smiled. "I think we've finally outgrown the garage." Thomas laughed softly. "I was wondering how long it would take before you said that." Annie looked toward the open garage door, imagining a small storefront with her brand's name above the entrance. For the first time, the dream no longer felt impossible. It felt like the natural next step. Nearly 2 years had passed since Annie received her very first order. What had once begun as a few shelves in the garage had steadily grown into a business that no longer fit inside the house. Every available corner was occupied by inventory, shipping supplies, printers, and neatly labeled boxes. Even the dining room occasionally became a packing station during busy weeks. One Saturday morning, Annie looked around the house and laughed. "I think our home officially became a warehouse." Thomas smiled. "I'd say that's a good problem to have." Annie nodded. "I think so too." Later that afternoon, they drove around the city looking at small retail spaces. Annie wasn't searching for anything extravagant. She simply wanted a place where customers could see the products for themselves. After visiting several locations, one small corner storefront immediately caught her attention. It wasn't large, and it needed a little work, but sunlight poured through the front windows, making the space feel warm and welcoming. Annie slowly walked across the empty room, imagining display shelves, a checkout counter, and a small worktable in the back for packing online orders. Thomas quietly watched from the doorway. "You like this one," he said. Annie smiled without taking her eyes off the room. "I can see it." "See what?" "My store." A few weeks later, after signing the lease and finishing the renovations, Annie unlocked the front door for the very first time. Above the entrance hung a simple black sign with elegant white lettering displaying the name of her brand. Inside, every display had been arranged by hand. Phone cases were organized by model and color, matching accessories sat neatly beside them, and small plants gave the store a warm, personal feel. On opening day, Maya walked through the door carrying a bouquet of flowers. "Congratulations, Mom." Annie accepted them with a smile. "Thank you." Maya looked around before laughing. "You know what?" Annie raised an eyebrow. "What? You used to get nervous just walking into job interviews." Annie smiled. She remembered sitting outside office buildings, rehearsing answers and wondering whether anyone would give a 42-year-old woman another chance. Back then, she had hoped someone would choose her. Today, she no longer needed anyone's permission to build the life she wanted. Thomas walked over and placed a small framed photo on the checkout counter. It showed Annie on her very first packing day in the garage, smiling while holding a single shipping label. Annie laughed. "You kept this?" Thomas nodded. "I wanted you to remember where all of this started." Annie looked around the little store once more. Every shelf, every product, and every customer represented something far more valuable than success. They represented the confidence she had fought so hard to find again. As the bell above the door rang to welcome another customer, Annie smiled warmly and stepped forward to greet them. This time, she wasn't introducing herself as someone looking for work. She was welcoming them into a business she had built with her own hands. By the second year, Annie's little store had become part of the neighborhood. Regular customers stopped by just to say hello. Parents brought their teenagers in to pick out new phone cases, and many people knew Annie by name. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Thomas continued running his company while Annie spent her days at the store. Every evening, no matter how busy they were, they met for dinner with Maya, Rich, and Bella whenever everyone's schedule allowed. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped feeling like two people trying to fix a broken marriage. They had simply become partners again. One Friday afternoon, Thomas walked into Annie's store carrying a small envelope. Annie smiled. "What are you hiding this time?" Thomas placed the envelope on the counter. "Keep next weekend free." Annie narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Family vacation." "Where?" "Where?" "It's a surprise." Annie laughed. "Every time you smile like that, I know you're hiding something. Thomas only grinned. You'll find out soon enough. The following Saturday, the whole family set off before sunrise. Nearly 3 hours later, they arrived at a quiet beachfront house overlooking the ocean. Perfect. Annie whispered as she stepped inside. Exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Thomas replied. For the next 2 days, nobody mentioned work. Annie left her phone inside for hours. Thomas ignored his emails. Maya helped Bella collect seashells while Rich insisted on teaching everyone how to build the perfect sandcastle despite having absolutely no idea what he was doing. Every evening they watched the sunset together, sharing childhood memories, funny family stories, and dreams for the future. Annie couldn't remember the last time she had felt this relaxed. On their final evening, Thomas suggested one last walk before dinner. The family wandered slowly along the shoreline while the setting sun painted the sky with shades of gold and orange. Rich and Bella ran ahead, chasing the waves, while Maya quietly followed a few steps behind, watching her parents with a smile. Thomas suddenly stopped walking. Annie turned toward him. Everything okay? Instead of answering, Thomas reached into his pocket. Annie immediately noticed how nervous he looked. It wasn't the expression of a successful businessman giving a presentation. It was the face of the young man she had fallen in love with decades earlier. Before Annie could say another word, Thomas slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Rich stopped running. Bella covered her mouth in surprise. Maya's eyes immediately filled with tears. Thomas opened a small velvet ring box. Inside rested a simple diamond ring. Elegant, beautiful, timeless, just like the one Annie had always dreamed of. Thomas looked up at her with gentle eyes. The first time I asked you to marry me, I promised to make you happy for the rest of your life. I believed those words with all my heart, but somewhere along the way I forgot that love isn't protected by promises. It's protected by the choices we make every single day. I hurt you. I failed you. And those are things I'll regret for the rest of my life. Annie felt tears rolling down her cheeks as Thomas continued. I'm not asking you to marry me again because I want to erase our past. I don't want to pretend those painful years never happened. They changed both of us. They taught us things we should have learned much sooner. I'm asking because we've both become different people. We've learned how to listen, how to forgive, how to choose each other again. He took a slow breath before holding the ring toward her. Annie, not for the couple we used to be, but for the family we've become. Will you marry me one more time and let us begin again? Annie covered her mouth as tears blurred her vision. She looked at Thomas, then at Maya, Rich, and Bella, whose faces were filled with hope. Finally, she smiled through her tears, gently reached out her hand, and whispered the one word Thomas had been waiting years to hear. Yes, Rich and Bella immediately cheered as Maya burst into tears and wrapped both of her parents in the biggest hug she could manage. Thomas slipped the ring onto Annie's finger before pulling her into his arms. As the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon, the family stood together on the beach, knowing that this proposal wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about choosing the future together. The wedding took place 3 months later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon by the same beach where Thomas had proposed. Annie didn't want a grand ballroom or an extravagant celebration. She had already experienced all of that once and knew beautiful decorations couldn't guarantee a happy marriage. This time, she wanted something simple, surrounded by the people who had stayed with her through the hardest years of her life. Their closest relatives gathered beneath a white floral arch facing the ocean, while the sound of gentle waves replaced the music of a traditional wedding hall. Maya stood proudly beside her mother, straightening Annie's dress one final time before the ceremony began. "You look beautiful," Maya whispered. Annie smiled through watery eyes. "Thank you." Maya gently squeezed her mother's hand. "No, thank you for never giving up. If you had accepted that miserable life, none of us would be standing here today." Annie pulled Maya into a long embrace. "I almost gave up." Maya shook her head. "But you didn't." At the other end of the aisle, Thomas adjusted his tie yet again. Rich laughed. "Grandpa, you've negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat." Thomas smiled nervously. None of those meetings mattered as much as the next 10 minutes. Everyone laughed. As the ceremony began, Annie slowly walked down the aisle with Maya by her side. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off her. Decades earlier, He had watched the same woman walk toward him full of hope. Today, she walked toward him carrying wisdom earned through heartbreak, forgiveness, and resilience. When Annie reached him, Thomas whispered, "You're breathtaking." Annie smiled softly. "You said that the first time, too." Thomas smiled. "I meant it then. I mean it even more now." The officiant welcomed everyone before inviting them to exchange their vows. Thomas spoke first. "Years ago, I promised to love you without truly understanding what love required. I thought providing a comfortable life was enough. I was wrong. Real love is choosing someone even when life becomes ordinary. It's listening before speaking. It's standing beside each other during failure, not just success. I can't promise to be perfect, but I can promise that I will never stop choosing you." Annie wiped away another tear before beginning her own vows. "I used to believe forgiveness meant pretending nothing happened. Now I understand it means refusing to let yesterday steal tomorrow. I don't stand here because our past was perfect. I stand here because we both had the courage to change. Thank you for believing in me when I had stopped believing in myself. Thank you for loving the woman I became instead of wishing I were still the woman I used to be." There wasn't a dry eye among the guests. Even Rich quietly wiped away tears while Bella openly cried beside him. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife once again, applause erupted across the beach. Thomas kissed Annie gently as everyone celebrated. During the reception, family members shared stories that filled the evening with laughter. Just before sunset, Maya stood to give the final toast. "When I was younger, I thought a successful marriage meant two people who never fought. As I grew older, I realized that's impossible. Every family faces storms. What matters is whether the people inside that family are willing to grow, admit when they're wrong, and keep choosing each other. Mom, Dad, thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to become better people." Everyone raised their glasses. Annie looked at Thomas, smiled, and intertwined her fingers with his. For the second time in their lives, they had become husband and wife. But unlike the first wedding, this marriage wasn't built on youthful dreams or unrealistic promises. It was built on experience, forgiveness, humility, and the quiet confidence that love, when cared for every day, could always find its way home.